going to show you two ways to sew a baby hem or a little rolled hem, and basically it's just a tiny little hem that's been folded over twice, and it can be a little bit fiddly if you don't have the right presser foot, but it can be done. So the first way I'm going to show you is when you sew a basting stitch around and then you fold your hem in without a presser foot. So like I said, the first step is to sew a basting stitch, and you're going to sew it as wide as you want your folds to be. So if your first fold is 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch, which is normal for a tiny rolled hem, that's where you're going to sew your basting stitch. And this is going to create a nice little fold line for you if you don't have a rolled hem foot. And just stitch carefully. I'm stitching, I think you can see there you go, 1/4 of an inch. I'm stitching my basting stitch at 1/4 of an inch all the way around this curve. And I'm going to use that as my fold line for this little hem. What this basting stitch does is it creates an easy way for you to fold your fabric evenly. So it's almost like perforated paper, and you're going to fold your fabric, iron it, and then we're going to stitch it down, and then we're going to fold it again. You don't have to stitch it twice. I just find it easier. So first you're going to fold it once and iron it nice and flat. And it creates a really easy fold line all the way around, despite the curve of the fabric. Because it is such a narrow hem, it doesn't make a big difference. It's not like putting a wide hem in a circle skirt. So here you can see you've created your first fold. Of course, we're sewing a double fold hem, but you've created your first fold, and we're going to fold it over again when we stitch the final stitching. But I have found it very helpful to stitch this little fold down first. And essentially what you're doing is you're creating your next fold line. So you're stitching as close to that edge as possible. Remember that you were using 1/4 inch. Stitch closely to that edge. You can of course use a basting stitch if you'd like. The main idea here is to stitch that down to create your next fold line and to hold it nicely in place when you fold it over again. I'm going to show you now. Look at how narrow this really is when you look close up. This is just your little 1/4 of an inch there. You can see how narrow that is. And then once you're done, you've got your first step of your hem done, but of course you want to fold this over twice, otherwise you might have. So here is what your hem looks like now, and you of course want to iron this. You want to remove that basting stitch. You just pull that right out, and if you have a fabric that unravels easily, you'll definitely want to fold it over again. You can of course be reckless and just leave it as is. I'm just removing my basting stitch here, and then I'm going back to my ironing board and I'm going to fold it again so that I have a double fold. Now if you're worried that you'll see that stitching, look at how easily this folds over. There's the stitching on the inside, and of course you'll be using fabric thread that matches your fabric. I'm using a lighter thread so you can easily see what I'm doing. And once you've ironed this, your final fold, you're just going to do the exact same thing you did for the first and second steps. Is you're going to sew on your 1/4 inch line, and you're just going to stitch this tiny little baby hem. You're going to stitch down. So it really isn't too difficult to sew a baby hem or a small rolled hem without the presser foot. The main thing you need to do is to get your hem even. And the easiest way to do that is to use a basting stitch using a. And of course, as I sew, I'm sewing as close to that little fold as possible. I want a nice even hem, and I want my stitching to be even. And there you can see the stitching. I've actually changed my bobbin thread for this. See on the inside 2 lines of stitching, and on the outside you only see 1 visible line of stitching. And there you have it. Nice, neat, tiny hem on your curved edge. The next one I'm going to show you, the next option, is how to sew a curved hem using a rolled hem foot. So the presser foot I'm using is a 1/4 inch rolled hem foot, and it looks like this, but I'm going to show you now how you know how wide that is. You actually just want to measure it with a measuring tape. So I'm using the inches part of my tape measure because my seam allowance is in inches, and you can see if you just measure it there, you can sort of fit it in there, but you don't really need to. There you can see it's going to fold over. So there's a 1/4 inch, that, and it's going to fold over. There's 1/2 inch and 1 inch. So that's just a 1/4 inch. And remember that it rolls your fabric over. So you are going to stitch a basting stitch at the 1/4 inch line on your fabric to get you started. So as I did the first time without the rolled hem foot, I'm going to sew a basting stitch at a 1/4 inch away from my raw edge now. And remember, basting stitch is a long straight stitch, and be very careful to keep it as a 1/4 inch. The problem if you stitch it wider is that when your fabric rolls over, it kind of rolls back, so you still have a raw edge sticking out. You want this to be as accurate as possible. So as you can see, it's fairly similar to what you've done without the presser foot. Once again, you're going to iron this. So there's your fold line that you've created, and you're going to iron it in. It's just going to make it so much easier for you. So I've ironed this on my fold line, and then it's going to fit in there. Look at that. And just because you've created the fold line and you have your 1/4 inch measure already, it's just going to make it so much easier for you to feed the fabric through this presser foot. Now it looks a bit tricky now because it's not attached to my machine, but as soon as it is attached to your machine, your feed dogs will catch it at the bottom. And I just use my unpicker to get it to feed in, to get that little fold to feed into the. So at the sewing machine now, you are going to feed this fabric with its fold into that little roll over there. And it seems much trickier than it is. Just lift it up slightly and just feed it in a little bit. Just very gently using a pin or something. And I sew my rolled hems before I sew my side seams. There are ways to neaten it up. It's not the end of the world, because you're not going to be able to sew a rolled hem over thick overlocking or a French seam. So what I like to do is that starting point. It can be a bit fiddly. See, I've unfolded my ironing, and then look how difficult it is. What I like to do is on my starting point, just to get my needle in, and then I fold it over using a pin or my unpicker. There you can see it's folded in. Look at that. And then you'll see when you're sewing, you're not necessarily going to hold this fabric straight in front of you. I hold it kind of to the side, because you're trying to keep that fold in there. So just get started, and you'll see that it pulls your fabric to the right, but I keep pulling it to the left, and I keep folding it over. You can use something sharp if you need to. I find it's not necessary if you've ironed this properly. It's just to get it started, and you want it to be in that little edge there. So keeping the raw edge of your fabric in the corner of your presser foot so that it keeps rolling over. And this does take some practice on a piece of fabric, but just keep it there. The fold will help, and you'll see it comes out the other side in such a nice little rolled hem at the back. And there you can see my rolled hem at the back. Look at how nice and even that is. And you can just keep going right up to the end, going slowly if you need to. But the more you practice this, the easier it gets.